Hello, good evening, and welcome. Thank you for coming to Shakespeare, Our Contemporary, Part 2. In Part 1, we looked at Shakespeare and his approach to war and revolution and asked the simple question, is Shakespeare's work still relevant to the 21st century? Today we move on to the question which is on everybody's mind, or the word. I suppose there are two words on everybody's mind. Can you think, I don't know, think of what the word which comes to your mind every 8 seconds, every 10 seconds. I think there are two concepts or words that we think about all the time. Which are those two words? And one of those we're going to focus on. Well, it's actually this one of the two. I don't know which one you had in mind, but it's money. Now, if you were thinking of the other one, you're very naughty. But money is our topic today, with its two manifestations, I call them, realizations, gold, and commodity. We'll come back to those other two in just a little bit later. I mean, the general question I'm asking today, apart from how does Shakespeare approach money and is it still relevant to us today? Because money was relevant then and probably it is very much so today. But the overall question I'm asking is he still our contemporary? After 64 years, when this book by Jan Kott was published and had an enormous impact on great directors like Peter Brook and the Royal Shakespeare Company and many, many others. He influenced the way we see Shakespeare, the way we perform Shakespeare, and the way we interpret him. And his argument was that Shakespeare was still very relevant, particularly in the context in which he was writing, which was in the Eastern Bloc, in a communist country at the time, Poland, and under Stalinist influence, as it were. And he found the history plays particularly, but not only the history plays, still relevant, particularly in a political sense. So we ask the question, and I'll come back to it at the end, after I've explored the topics we're focusing on today. You may agree or disagree, but whatever you do, do engage. I'm going to ask questions. You can think about the answers. You can write the answers in the chat box. That's up to you. As long as you're engaging in some way, and I hope I help you engage by not boring you. My overall hypothesis, if you like, my explanatory framework for this topic, is that all of Shakespeare's plays, whether they're histories, tragedies, comedies, pastoral plays, romances, in some way reflect or refract through their words and their characters what I call the death throes of feudalism and the birth pangs of capitalism. What we see is the old order of feudalism dying and the new order, which is basically still with us, capitalism, being born. That's my overall hypothesis, and I'll try and illustrate it and come back to it at the end, as all good PhD students do. That's my thesis. So, how does Shakespeare describe money? Well, I'd like you to think, first of all, how you would describe money. I'm sure it was one of the two words in your mind, maybe three you had in mind. But how would you describe this valuable entity, commodity, money? In terms of adjectives, if you like, think of adjectives, positive or negative. And then I'll show you, once you've started thinking and engaging, a frequency count from the complete works of Shakespeare with the help of AI. I checked how Shakespeare describes money in all of his work. And we'll look at the main concepts behind his view of money. So if you're thinking and you promise me you've actually thought of an adjective or a way you feel about money, I'll show you this. These are the adjectives that come up most often in the context, in collocation with, as we linguists say, with the word money. And what obviously hits you, the largest font, remember, is the most frequent word. The largest is rich, not surprisingly, but the opposite as well, poor. So the difference between these two antithetical notions, wealth, poverty, is at the heart of Shakespeare's approach to money and its related terms, gold and commodity. There are other words here. Most of them I find, looking at them, they tend to be, I must say, on the negative side. So whoever Shakespeare was, he certainly had a negative view of money. And there are some interesting ones, like generous, which is quite positive. It's good when somebody's generous with their money, and we'll meet someone on our journey who was generous with catastrophic consequences. In fact, he was prodigal. There's the word there. Prodigal, prodigality, and excessive spending of money is prodigality, and so on. Opulent, stingy, like Scrooge, and so on. I wonder if some of these match what you thought of money. Now, these words, poverty and wealth, poor, let's take the word poor and get some inspiration from another William, my other great passion, poetically speaking, of basically three Williams. The first William is William Shakespeare. The second, I don't know if you can guess it, they're both romantic poets, the second and the third, William Wordsworth. And the third William is William Blake, one of the first romantic poets who wrote much about wealth and poverty and the Industrial Revolution and about money. He wrote about many, many things, religion. Wonderful, wonderful poet. If you haven't discovered him, you're in for a treat. And he's got this beautiful poem, which is a puzzle for me, for you, because I've left a word out. And I want you to see if you can guess which word is missing. And if you're good, at the end of the session, I'll tell you the answer and how it relates to everything I'm going to say. He begins, however, with the word pity. And I've highlighted the word poor, which came up in Shakespeare very frequently. And this is the way Blake puts the two concepts of pity and poverty together. Very thought-provoking. He says, pity would be no more if we did not make somebody poor. And something no more could be if all were as happy as we. I love the simplicity of those words, his innocence and experience. He writes as if he's writing for children, and he loved children. And we'll come back to that something at the end. With that inspiration, for me at least, let's move on to another quiz for you, a little bit more down to earth and up to date. Three fairly modern writers, not 21st century, they're all in the past, two in the 19th and 20th centuries. And anyway, one of them was passionate about Shakespeare. The other two couldn't stand him. Fancy not standing the greatest writer who ever lived, but who couldn't stand him and who was passionate? I've given you three choices. Bernard Shaw, author of Pygmalion, lovely play. Leo Tolstoy, the great War and Peace, his novel. Some people say the greatest novel ever written. Anna Karenina, another one. And Karl Marx, the author of Das Kapital, and someone who changed the world in his way, for good or for bad. Which of them was passionate about Shakespeare? I wonder if you've got it right. Look at their faces. Which one loved Shakespeare? Which one was envious and hated his guts? Well, Karl Marx loved Shakespeare, and Shakespeare shaped Marx's thought to some extent, and we'll see why. But the other two couldn't stand it. We won't go into why now. They may have been right, they may have been wrong. But why did Karl Marx have a passion for Shakespeare? And which of these plays was he particularly passionate about? And which did he talk about? One of them was his absolute favorite in terms of number of references, but he talks about at least two of the others, if not all of them, somewhere in his work. Now, the one he liked most of all, and I'll tell you why, is Timon of Athens, a rather obscure play, except to Shakespeare fanatics like me who did his PhD, but my MA dissertation on Timon of Athens, way back in 1974 when I was but a young man. And why was Timon of Athens so important to Marx? Well, this is the obvious answer in a way. Timon of Athens explores the corrosive or corrupting effects of money on social relationships, which is exactly, of course, what Marx tried to do. Successfully or not is up to you to decide. But that's what he found fascinating. I suppose I discovered this when I studied the play. And Timon himself discovers things. He discovers that his wealth does not bring friendship. He's a rich lord in Athens in ancient times. He's in Plutarch, who wrote his life, Plutarch's lives, and he was generous towards his friends, indeed almost prodigal in his generosity. He gave his friends whatever money they wanted to borrow, and gifts, very expensive gifts, and he never asked for anything back. There you go. There's the plot resume. Now, if you spend and spend as if there is no tomorrow, eventually the creditors catch up with you, as we in Greece perhaps found out a few years ago, and many other countries in Europe. He goes bankrupt. The creditors want their money. He can't pay. He goes bankrupt. He asks his friends for help. They haven't got any money, they say. They can't help him. They don't want to help him. They desert him. And of course, he's disillusioned. He's rejected by them, and he rejects them. And he goes off into the wilderness, hating Athens, people, mankind, womankind, indeed. And there in the woods, the wilderness, like so many other Shakespeare anti-heroes, he makes discoveries, self-discovery above all. But first he is digging for roots to eat, and he discovers gold. Now, can you imagine his reaction to finding gold? You would have thought he'd be delighted when he finds gold. What he wants is something to eat, to survive. Now, gold was important in those days. Bear in mind, just a brief reminder, how the voyages of discovery of the 16th century, of Christopher Columbus and the others, Cortez and the rest of them, and the Portuguese, Spanish, English voyages of discovery to the New World, looking above all for silver and gold. Eventually, of course, they found it. And it came pouring back into Europe. Here are the natives, back in South America, as we call it today, after one of these explorers, Vespucci America, what's his name? That's where America comes from, Amerigo or something. Anyway, here they are panning for gold, like Caliban in The Tempest, with his island. He's taken over there by Prospero, and these islanders were taken over by the Europeans, and they pan or search the rivers and the seas for gold, and they find gold. It goes back to Europe, and the impact of gold on Europe, of course, was, as you can imagine, well, can you imagine the impact? It was very, very important, of course. This new commodity, this new realization of money, it caused enormous inflation. And of course, prices, when they go up, the rich can afford to pay, usually, but the rest of us, and the poor particularly, when commodities or products, goods, go up by as much as 400% in the 16th century, then people have great difficulty surviving. And that's what happened. Let me go back to Shakespeare and his description of gold now. Think about gold. Imagine if you had lots of gold. I'm sure you would be very happy. It's very important to the modern economy, to modern capitalism, and there are adjectives, usually positive, that we use to describe gold. So are Shakespeare's adjectives about gold positive or negative? Is your view positive or negative about gold? Again, the frequency count. Go to the computer, go to AI, ask it to search the complete works of Shakespeare or the topics Shakespeare discusses in the context of gold, and you find poison, you find slave, you find serpent, you find confusion, lust, iniquity, misery. I don't have difficulty finding the negative words here. Sorrow, scourge, cage, temptress. Where are the positive words? Well, Shakespeare had a very negative view, whoever he was, of gold. He had a negative view of money, but a particularly negative view of gold, which of course is the ultimate expression of money. And let's go to Timon now, the play I studied when I was just 22 years old, and look at the famous speech that Marx quotes again and again. And you'll see why, perhaps, but I won't say much. I'll let you listen to it, enjoy it, I hope. It's the moment in the story I've told you when Timon has left Athens, disillusioned, goes to the wilderness, digging for roots, he finds gold, and this is what he says.
Timon of Athens discovers gold. Gold? Yellow, glittering, precious gold? No, gods. Thus much of this will make black white, foul fair, wrong right, base noble, old young, coward valiant. Ah, you gods, why this? What this, you gods? Why, this will lug your priests and servants from your sides, pluck stout men's pillows from below their heads. This yellow slave will knit and break religions, bless the accursed, make the whore leprosy adored, place thieves and give them title, knee, and approbation with senators on the bench. Come, damned earth, thou common whore of mankind, that put'st odds among the rout of nations, I will make thee do thy right nature.
That's very interesting, to say the least. But there's an overall pattern in this diversity of impacts that gold has on our lives. But the overall picture I get is of, indeed, corrosion, corruption, but particularly transformation, the way gold transforms people, society, relationships, families, religions, positions of power are granted to the corrupt, the thieves, it says, will be given a title, Sir, Lord, Earl. Even today, people who make a lot of money, even if it's by crooked means, end up in the House of Lords nowadays. But Shakespeare is saying, or Timon of Athens is saying, that the senators, the people in power, get there because of this availability of gold and its impact. And it gives people who are crooks positions of power. I don't know if that sounds familiar to you when you look around at elections nowadays and people running for president. It'll make lowly people the third line. For example, the base refers to the common people. It'll make a commoner a noble if they've got enough money. And the old can be made younger. Well, you know, if you have a lot of money, you can, I don't know, spend money to make yourself look younger. Women or Hollywood stars waste their money doing this kind of thing. So this is what gold does. And you can see it deceives. It's an illusion. It's a liar. And religions particularly. Servants. The servants is relevant to this theme of feudalism. And servants, of course, were loyal to their masters. And it will take them from their sides, the sides of their masters, if money is or gold is offered to them, and so on. So that's the picture. We'll look more closely at the metaphors that Shakespeare uses for describing gold in this play and in others. So the metaphors. So what does he compare gold to? You've already had an idea like this. You've seen that gold here is in effect being described as a slave that will do the bidding of whoever has got it and will achieve things, that you can't achieve otherwise. So let's say the metaphor here is of a slave, a transforming, corrupting, or destructive power. But also in another part of the play, creditors, people who lend money at a particularly exorbitant rates, usurers they're called, are called bawds, because bawd is a pimp working with prostitutes, running brothels. Bawds between gold and want are the kind of middlemen between gold and want. Want is need. You need something, you go to a bawd, a pimp, and they'll do what they do, immoral though it may be, because of gold. So it's compared to a prostitute, pimp, and it spreads disease. People were obsessed in those days with venereal disease. It was very common. In Henry IV, Part 2, we have the metaphor of cankered, which is a synonym some of you will know. This is Henry IV, the king, talking to his son about what he should be wary of as he takes power, because gold will corrupt his ministers, his government, because it's a kind of cancer or canker, as we talk about in plants in the context of flowers, plants, cankers. In Romeo and Juliet, too, Romeo talking to the apothecary or the chemist. He's gone to buy poison from the chemist so he can die unhappily ever after with Juliet, or so he thinks, of course. But he gives gold in order to purchase the poison. But he explains to the apothecary that the gold he's giving the man, the old man there, is worse than poison. He's got the real poison, gold. And the metaphor here is poison. A killer. Gold is poison. It's a killer. So there you go. I think that's it. I think we should move on and look at not a tragedy like Romeo and Juliet or Timon of Athens, but in a comedy. I said, I believe what I have to say applies to both, well, all of Shakespeare's genre, the genre of tragedy, comedy, romance, and so on, history plays. And particularly in Shakespeare's comedies, people don't expect to find much which is of political interest. Well, you'll be surprised. I hope as we look at As You Like It, one of the so-called happy comedies, a pastoral romantic comedy, because it's set in the country, and I've called this section The City and the Country and the City. The city or the court, in those days the court was the heart of city life, where all the power was, where anybody who was anybody had to be. And As You Like It will illustrate my hypothesis, I hope, that what we see in Shakespeare's plays unfolding is feudal contradictions, certainly conflict. There is conflict in the medieval times as we approach the Renaissance in the 16th century, but there are contradictions. There are things pulling in different directions. And we're going to look at, by contrast, the ladies of the court talking to the country folk. There's a nice contradiction or antithesis for you. I'll tell you who these ladies are right away. But first, a little quiz to wake you up. Wakey, wakey, terminology, vocabulary. If you're an English teacher, how good an English teacher are you? This is the ultimate test. Which word in the dictionary will tell us that the process whereby the worker is made to feel foreign to the products of his or her own labor is called, what word is being described? Imagine a worker or a farmer who feels foreign to the products of his own labor. Well, the word, if you, I don't know, had time to think, it's not an easy question, to be unfair. I don't think I would get this correct. I'm cheating. Alienation. So a lot of people feel alienated in their office jobs, in whatever job. Even we teachers often feel alienated, unsupported, cut off from a process which we would like to be a part of. An example from As You Like It of alienation is Corin, the shepherd. Here he is. He's a good man. He works for a feudal lord, his master. So he tells us, I'm shepherd to another man. The other man is the feudal lord. And the alienation is that all he does is sit there looking at the sheep. He does nothing else. He doesn't shear them. He doesn't sell them. Doesn't make use of the wool. It was a very important commodity in those days. So he's alienated. He doesn't have any power over his work or over his life in many ways. In the court itself, where his master can be found, and let's say his master is Oliver. There he is, Oliver. He's the one standing up there, higher than his brother, because they're fighting. Orlando is the brother of Oliver. Orlando's the good guy. He's the good lord. They're both aristocrats. And we see them squabbling. We'll see aristocrats squabbling time and again in this presentation. But the good feudal lord, Orlando, is brave, he's chivalrous, and he's handsome, of course. It's a romantic comedy, remember? But not only. A good romantic comedy says much more than cliches about love and so on. So why is he in conflict with his brother Oliver? Oliver has the power. Oliver has disinherited him, and he won't let him have the money and the wherewithal to live like a gentleman, as he says there on the right. He was born a gentleman by birth, and he's treated like an ox, worse than horses. And to say that is to say he's been treated a bit like a commoner, an ordinary, lowly person, a peasant, because they were compared to the animals. They were just above the animals in the pecking order. So there we see the city or the court in conflict, the feudal class squabbling. In another court, in another part of the city, let's say, we find this lord of the manor, Duke Frederick, on the right, another nasty master. Perhaps he's Corin's master, who knows? He's very, very bad because he's exiled his brother too. The good duke who's in the forest of Arden, you may have heard, it's an ideal Robin Hood type of situation. They've gone off to the forest, this man's brother, because he's been kicked out, he's been threatened, and Duke Frederick has taken over the palace, the power, the money, the gold. Now he wants to exile the daughter of the exiled Duke, Rosalind. There she is, hugging her cousin Celia, the daughter of this man, and she's accused of treachery. She's been deprived of her wealth, so she talks about her poverty, but she's innocent. Of course, she's a lovely heroine. She's our heroine. She's a good woman, and so is Celia, but they're going to go off together in the forest. If this nasty duke is going to exile one, he's going to have to exile both of them. So they're both going to go into the forest like Orlando and meet the country folk and live happily ever after like Robin Hood and his merry men. So that's the basic situation in As You Like It. We move from the court to the country. And in the country, we're going to meet the shepherd, Corin. We've met him already. When Rosalind and Celia meet him. They ask him, of course, about the forest. They want somewhere to live. They want somewhere to take shelter. They want food and all the things you need to survive. And they've got money. But he says, look, that's what they want. There they are meeting. Now, you're not supposed to notice there that Rosalind on the right is actually a woman. She's a boy now. She's dressed up as a boy. Ganymede, the favorite of the gods, Ganymede. But anyway, she's disguised as a boy for safety's sake and other reasons, which we won't go into now. And she says, I've got love, one of the things we may think about every 8 seconds, or the other word for it, or gold. She's got these things in abundance, she says suddenly, that, and she can buy entertainment. Entertainment means all the things I've mentioned, like accommodation, shelter, food, that kind of thing, and freedom, if you like, to do things they want to do in the forest. So she asks him to provide these things, to bring us where we can rest and feed. He's unfortunately unable to do this. He says, he explains that he's got a nasty master who's of a churlish, evil disposition. And he doesn't live by the rules of hospitality like a good feudal lord is supposed to live. And he says, besides, he's got financial problems as well. His coat, his cottage, see there in the 4th line, his flocks and his pastures, his bounds of feed, are up for sale. He can't afford to keep them anymore. So he's going bankrupt, you see. It's all about money and gold at the end of the day. So he's absent at the moment. There is nothing that you will feed on. He says, I can't help you. But of course, Rosalind and Celia are rich aristocrats. They've left the court, but they've still got access in some mysterious way to their wealth, so they can buy whatever he has to sell. He can't sell the stuff himself. He says, for me, nothing is important. I mean, all I need is a bit of money for the means of survival. And that will make me content. Means, money, and content. He calls them his 3 good friends. So you see, his demands as a poor shepherd, alienated from his labor, is mere survival. And that's all money means to him, and material wealth. But Rosalind and Celia, they have wealth in abundance. They can buy the cottage, they say, the pastures, the flock. They'll buy everything. We'll pay for it. And they'll employ him as well. And they'll give him his wages. You see, he'll have good masters or mistresses, as it were. And they want to waste their time to relax in the bucolic atmosphere, the idyllic, the pastoral atmosphere of the Forest of Arden. Waste, that's what waste means here, to entertain yourself without worry, being idle. So, where was it? So, he explains that that's okay then. These things are for sale, and he'll make arrangements and for them to buy all this stuff with their gold, that says at the bottom, buy it with your gold, right suddenly, with no delay. So he's going to arrange all of that, and he will become their faithful feeder. Sounds like it's going to be a loyal feudal serf or servant. Like Adam, the other servant in the play, there he is, there's Adam, the servant of the nasty duke that exiled the good Orlando. This is the good aristocrat Orlando, handsome and chivalrous. Remember, you see? Have a good look. Is he handsome, chivalrous, brave? Well, he looks chivalrous. He's carrying this poor old man, Adam, and he associates the good old man with what he calls in the second line, look at this, the constant service of the antique world. The antique world is the feudal world, the old days, the good old days when feudalism worked When it was at its best, everybody knew their place. The lord of the manor, the king in his palace, the servants and the serfs in their place, the farmers laboring away. And they did it out of duty in the good old days. Duty, not for meed, not for reward, not for profit. Unlike these times, says Orlando, these times, meaning modern times, Shakespeare's times, if you like, when people will only sweat, will only work for promotion, for gain, for profit. So there you have it. The old world order, the antique world. Shakespeare looking back to times when things were basically better in the feudal order. The feudal order, as I said, is under stress and strain. But we must move on. Time for you to answer a question. Are you thinking? I'm going to give you the definitions, various definitions of one word, and you have to guess the word. It's especially for the language teachers listening. There you are, 8 definitions of the same word. Self-interest. But it's also assets, advantage, benefit. It's useful, it's expedient. It can mean gain or profit. It's something having value. More economic terminology would say it was an object produced by human labor or an article with exchange value, a kind of merchandise. Which word is it? We've got 8 clues. Well, I can't help you anymore. Perhaps you want to phone a friend or ask the audience. You can ask me, and the answer is, I've got the answer right here. Commodity. Now, which of these definitions do you associate with the word commodity? It's the third of our key words today. Money was the first, gold, and now commodity, number 3, our trilogy. You may decide that for you, commodity means one of these. It doesn't matter, they're all possible meanings. And we shall see how Shakespeare uses this word commodity in various ways, but still relevant perhaps today. So there they are. These are the 3 words we're focusing on, and we're finishing with the third one, commodity. And the play we're looking at now, moving on from the comedy, As You Like It, the Greek play, Timon of Athens. We're looking at a history play, King John, about the 13th century, time of the Magna Carta. King John was the guy who had to sign the Magna Carta, which the nobles forced him to. And it's a play, we are told, that exposes power as a commodity for which men are in hungry competition. That's the theme, and it sounds a very interesting theme to me. And it sounds very contemporary, I would say. Those words, power, competition, they're still very, very resonant in the 21st century. And people do fight for power as a kind of commodity. Gives you power, like gold, like silver, like money. Commodity gives you power. Here is then another speech for you, which gives me an opportunity to rest my voice and listen to the speech by a character in King John. The context is, you should know, the war, the endless war between England and France. These wars went on and on forever. You remember the 100 Years' War, Wars of the Roses. Now, the war with France in the 13th century was between King John and the French king as to who owns this valuable real estate of France. They squabble. Eventually, though, they make peace. Now, this character, who's an aristocrat, Philip the Bastard, is called. He's illegitimate, which is why he's called the Bastard. I'm not being rude towards him. That is his official name in the play. He's actually an aristocrat and the illegitimate son of Richard the Lionheart. Okay, and he's been deprived of the throne or his right to succeed to the throne by his nasty brother, yet another nasty feudal brother. So he's angry, he's cynical, but he's also a representative of that chivalrous old order, the antique world, when these people were knights going off in shining armor to fight wars for truth and justice and nonsense like that. But that's the context. So when peace is made between the two countries, he's not all that pleased. He actually has a cynical interpretation involving commodity in the agreement of peace. And he's going to explain why. I'll let you listen to his explanation. The peace has been signed between France and England. The kings are at peace. And why have they done it? And how does he feel about it?
From King John, Philip the Bastard describes the power of commodity. Mad world, mad kings, mad composition. Commodity, that same purpose changer, that sly devil, that broker that still breaks the pate of faith, that daily break vow, he that wins of all, of kings, of beggars, old men, young men, maids, that smooth-faced gentleman, tickling commodity, the bias of the world, this board, this broker, this all-changing word. And why rail I on this commodity? Well, whilst I am a beggar, I will rail and say there is no sin but to be rich. And being rich, my virtue then shall be to say there is no vice but beggary. Since kings break faith upon commodity, gain be my Lord, for I will worship thee.
I said, compare this to what Timon said about gold. And I think, in effect, you could actually interchange the words commodity and gold. You can put gold here. What the bastard Philip says about commodity is what Timon said about gold. And you can see the metaphors of change or transformation, distortion, corruption. It's a broker. We have the same metaphor of the board, the pimp, once again, all for gain, see, all for profit. And as we were told about gold, it can transform social relationships, which in those days were very fixed, your position in society. It can make beggars of kings and kings of beggars, old men young, and so on. We heard this about gold. But so there it is. There is no sin but to be rich, he says cynically. You see, I said he's a kind of feudal lord himself of the Romantic school. I say, however, he's cynical. This is also one of the new men representing the rise of capitalism. Why do I say that? Because he's looking after number one. He's focusing on the individual, himself. I am myself alone is his philosophy. And what he's saying is that, look, I envy those who are rich. Therefore, it's a sin to be rich. Towards the bottom there. There is no sin but to be rich. But when I am rich, he says, my virtue then shall be to say, there is no vice but beggary. So then he'll make fun of the poor, you see. So he's looking after his self-interest, his expedient, profit, gain, all those words that describe commodity. You see, and he says, since kings, his conclusion at the bottom, break faith upon commodity, gain be my Lord, for I will worship thee. So he's worshipping gain, profit, gold. So these meanings, I think, all come into the way Philip the Bastard uses the word commodity, or Shakespeare. Kings break faith upon commodity, this broker, this all-changing word. Can explain these quotations using any of these first 6, at least, definitions. I hope you agree. He calls commodity the bias of the world, which actually means the thing that gives the world direction, like the bias on a bowl in the sport. Aristocrats used to play of bowls. The bowls had a bias to them. They swerved, they went in a particular direction. And commodity is like that. It takes the world in a particular direction. And because this honorable war, as he called it, that's his feudal voice speaking, has been agreed on in a vile, base and vile concluded peace. He's going to look after number 1 from now on. So you can see what I mean by he's a very divided character, very contradictory character, representing both feudal values and modern capitalist ones. Gain be my lord, which is what capitalism revolves around, of course. The idea of profit as a motive, as the gain, is almost the positive aspect of the way the markets work. They won't work if there isn't gain or profit to be made, and that's perfectly understandable. So in which part of the world in those days was this particularly true, that capitalism was the driving force, money and profit and gain were the driving force of political power and economic power? Which city-state was the first to embody these new capitalist values, moving away from feudalism? Well, this is a picture of it. You may guess which one it is from the gondolas. It's not difficult to guess. And Shakespeare was very fond of this city, whether he'd been there or not. Certainly sounds as if he'd been there, because he writes so much about it in so much detail in Othello and in The Merchant of Venice, we'll come back to. But why it was important in those days, economically, politically, culturally, was it was considered to be the first capitalist state. Moving out of feudalism, about Shakespeare's time, it's about time Shakespeare was writing that these things are happening. And the people in power, ruling class in those days, used their capital to exercise power with their cash, their ships, their commodities, use their control of government to increase their profits. That's history, that's the historical background, the importance of money, gold, and commodities in Venice. But Shakespeare makes this very clear in Othello, where he gets his villain, Iago, who is jealous of Othello, the Moor of Venice. But here we'll just focus on what it says about money. And as you can see from the frequency with which the word comes up in his speech here, this is one all taken from one and the same speech. He's obsessed with money, apart from sex, as he says about Desdemona, money and sex, or money and love, whatever you want to call it. Put money in thy purse. That's what life is all about, filling your pockets with money. He says it again and again, as if, he wants his friend Roderigo, who he's speaking to get the message. So I think just visually that's enough as an expression of the power of money in Venice in the 16th and 17th century. And we're going to go to the more famous play from the point of view of money in Shakespeare's work, The Merchant of Venice. And we're going to look at the role of credit and creditors, and Shylock, of course, is the creditor, the famous Jewish character. Shylock is a creditor or a usurer, as they're called in the play, a moneylender who lends at exorbitant rates. Remember, in Timon of Athens, we saw creditors. They were described as devils. They were pursuing Timon, and the poor man was driven to madness and escaped to the wilderness. And we'll look at this in The Merchant of Venice, these concepts: money, gold, and commodification, and the role of creditors, particularly in the form of Shylock. the Jew. But the story begins, the problem, as I call it, our plot, with a young man. As always, it's a romantic comedy. I think it's more of a romantic tragedy, if you ask me, but it's a mixture. It's a bit of a problem play, in my opinion. But officially, it's one of the comedies. There's a lot of romance in it. And this man on the right, Bassanio, has a problem. You see, he's an aristocrat. He's a gentleman, but he's got no money. What's the use of being a gentleman without any money? He's got debts. Second line, he's been too prodigal. You see that word prodigal, excessive in his spending of money. And all his property is gauged, has left me gauged, engaged, or mortgaged, as we call it today. He doesn't control his property anymore. He's so much in debt. So what do? They sell off their land, as we saw earlier on in As You Like It. That's what they do with these aristocrats. It's the aristocracy in crisis, the title of a famous book about this issue by Lawrence Stone, the crisis of the aristocracy. So he goes to his friend Antonio on the left, Jeremy Irons, the handsome Jeremy Irons. They're both supposed to be handsome young men, Christians. It's important that they are Christians. And Antonio, he says, I owe you the most in money and in love. There's almost a homoerotic relationship between these two men, but we won't go down that road at this moment. But what Bassanio wants to do is to borrow some money from his friend Antonio. Why? So he can marry this rich lady, Portia, a lady richly left. So she's got a huge dowry, got a huge palace, Belmont, just outside Venice. So this is another world outside Venice, remember? It's a feudal world. It's a kind of fairy tale world. The fairy tale of the three caskets, if you remember, gold, silver, and lead. It's a fairy tale, but I think it's a very materialistic fairy tale when we interpret it in the framework we're discussing today. So he wants to marry, Sani wants to marry a lady, not Maggie Smith, but Portia, her name is. That's the lovely Maggie Smith when she was young. In Belmont is a lady. Okay, so to do this, he needs money, though. An aristocrat needs money to get married, and he's a bit of a dowry hunter, if you ask me. But Antonio wants to help his friend, and his problem, in turn, is that he doesn't have the money now, because his ships are out at sea, his fortunes, as he calls them. So he has neither money nor commodity to give him the present sum that he needs, the amount of money, to go and marry this beautiful princess. But he says, we'll go around Venice asking the moneylenders, using my credit, my good name. I have a good name in Venice, to see what we can get. And of course, you know who he goes to. They go to the creditors, the IMF, or Shylock, I should have said, sorry, slip of the tongue. They go to Shylock, and there's Shylock, who gives him the money. They make the deal. I won't bore you with the story. You should know by now. Well, there's Al Pacino playing Shylock. It's been a good film made of The Merchant of Venice with Al Pacino. And Shylock agrees to lend Antonio the money to give to his friend Bassanio. And he says, look, let's make a deal, a bond. Let's, as we have nowadays, bonds, homologa. The deal is, if you don't pay me back, don't worry, I don't want the money. You just give me a pound of your flesh, just as a bit of a joke. But of course, the joke turns sour because the money indeed is not available at the time the bond becomes due. And Shylock wants his pound of flesh, even if it means killing Antonio. There they are in the court with all the important Venetians looking on, and Bassanio looking on as we're about to sacrifice Antonio on the altar of profit, of gain, as Shylock takes his revenge on these Christians who he says have been tormenting him and humiliating him and lending out money gratis. Worst of all, they've been giving money without asking for interest. So a good creditor, of course, wants his interest, as we all know. So they appeal to Shylock. Don't kill the man. Wait, we'll find the money. And Portia will give the money, she says. She will find the money. But he doesn't want to listen to pleas of mercy or pity. He wants his pound of flesh. And I ask, well, this must be against the law. Is it? Is it against the law to take a man's pound of flesh? That's the deal. That's the bond. That's what it says. They both signed it. But is it against the Venetian law? Well, this is the argument by Shylock that according to Venetian law, the law of Venice, the Charter of Venice is based on the solidity, the reliability, the applicability of the law. Your city's freedom is based on this principle. I made a bond, I want my money, or I want my pound of flesh. I stand here for law. I crave the law again and again, penalty, and so on. And he even tells them, the senators and the judges, he turns the tables on them. He says, you own slaves. You see here? You purchase slaves. And you treat them like asses and dogs and mules, like animals. You own them because you bought them. I don't tell you to let them free. So you should not tell me, says Al Pacino, Shylock, to set Antonio free. The slaves are ours, you say. Well, I say, Antonio is mine. He's my slave, or his pound of flesh is mine. I want it. I bought it dearly. He's lost his money, you see. It's mine and I will have it. And it's the law. That's the thing, the crux of the matter. The law is on Shylock's side, not on Antonio, the good Christian, but on this evil moneylender, this usurer. How are we going to resolve this? This is the modern capitalist world in action. It's legal to do this, but you agree, I'm sure, I think it's inhumane to do this. But how are we going to impose a humane, merciful approach? Well, Portia to the rescue. Remember, Portia lives in Belmont, the palace, the feudal palace, the aristocratic palace outside Venice. She belongs to the antique world of good feudalism, where the quality of mercy is not strained. The famous speech about mercy, and quite rightly famous, it's a beautiful speech, and she's arguing that the law is on Shylock's side, yes, but the traditional laws, traditional morality, talks of mercy, even though it's not within the framework of the law. She argues it's something that comes not from the law, but from heaven, from God himself and his representative on earth, the king or the queen, the mightiest and the mightiest. That's what mercy is. And the mightiest are the monarchs. The aristocrat, obviously. Monarch is an aristocrat. He belongs to the feudal world. And he could show mercy if he wanted. That was the good thing about the feudal world. Who cared about the law? If the master loved you and you loved your master, he would look after you. He would show you mercy. No such human values seem to exist in this early form of capitalism. So there you go. So how are we going to resolve this? I call it a bailout. Belmont bails out Venice. Feudal values come to the rescue of capitalism. In other words, the traditional morality, the idealized, if you like, morality of feudalism is applied to get round the law of Venice and to punish Shylock. And if we look at the two worlds in terms of the language used, on the left, I have the feudal world of the aristocracy, the old antique world, where there is abundance of money, a prodigality of money. These figures are huge for those times, thousands and thousands. And as I told you, Portia is happy to pay thousands of ducats or whatever they are to buy the bond and save the pound of flesh and Antonio's life. But all Shylock can talk about is thrift, being good, not in the moral sense, but in the economic sense of being a trustworthy borrower. You pay back, you're credit worthy. That means good, credit worthy. So all Shylock thinks about is money and thrift and credit. So that's the world which, like a deus ex machina, comes to the rescue of Antonio and the immorality of capitalism. The old world values of a paternalistic society where people were protected by their lords as long as they were loyal, dutiful, were serviceable, they did their job without complaining, and they were shown mercy and charity, hospitality, generosity, and they were serfs at the end of the day. But those were the comforts before industrialization, when perhaps in many ways for these people things got worse. So if we come up to the modern day and look how this connection, this antithesis, this contradiction between, on the one hand, the feudal bond between people, between human beings, based on feeling and mercy, in conflict with the commercial bond based on credit worthiness, being able to pay your debts, and the ruthless consequences of not being able to. We'll come into the modern era in a moment to see how this affects us today in the 21st century. But just the postscript to the Merchant of Venice, the tragic irony for me is that Shylock, who has been persecuted in his turn, as we know, the Jewish people have for centuries been persecuted by Europeans and by their role as creditors, as moneylenders. They take Shylock's money, his property, his religion, and as he explains at the end, tragically, you take my life, you take these things from me. You take my house, you take my life, you leave me with nothing. And they force him to convert Christianity, which is not very nice, is it? It's not very Christian. And Antonio, Bassanio, Portia, they're all supposed to be good Christians. That's why I call the play a problem. I think you can see why. In the modern day now, let's imagine Shylock is a modern creditor, and let's imagine Antonio is a debtor country, a bit like Greece was, and many other countries have been during the recent financial crisis. So to make the comparison explicit, we can see Shylock as the ruthless creditor, a bit like what I call the Troika and their pitiless pound of flesh. He wants his pound of flesh from Antonio. He wants his bond, like the IMF and the Council of European Ministers, the European Central Bank, the Troika as it's called. They demanded that Greece and other countries who were going bankrupt should pay their debts as agreed in their bonds. No talk of mercy or pity. And these deals were, of course, applied. There was no deus ex machina coming to the rescue, as in Merchant of Venice. There's no feudal order anymore with, romantic feudal lords with a good heart. What we got instead was the Greek debt crisis and the deal imposed on Greece to borrow more money to keep paying its old debts, and getting deeper and deeper into debt and doing the dictates of the creditors, homes being taken from people, people becoming literally homeless, hunger becoming widespread among some members of the population, unemployment spreading, and the obligatory privatization of Greece's assets to the creditors, a bit like Shylock, the way he had to give up his property to the state or to the good Christians. And it's Greece's loss of sovereignty, which is its lifeblood. A country's life is its sovereignty. If you don't have sovereignty, you don't have freedom, you don't have anything. So there you go. So it became a debt state at the end, and it still is really still deep in debt. And as I read in the Financial Times just the other day, the second poorest country in Europe, largely because of these deals imposed on it by the IMF and the rest of the creditors. So it's no longer what we used to call a tax state, but a debt state. That's its main characteristic. So you see why I make the comparison. I'm not the only one to have thought of this. Yanis Varoufakis, Greece's finance minister at the time of the debt crisis in 2015, describes the loans that Greece had been forced to keep taking as predatory loans, a bit like vultures, being imposed on Greece. And the more loans, of course, you borrow, the more deep you get into debt, the more you lose your sovereignty, your freedom. So they, in that sense, are predatory. There are other ways, perhaps, of dealing with this problem, apart from showing mercy. But that's about the long and the short of it. So there's Varoufakis after he'd been beaten up by hooligans in Athens, after he was no longer the Minister of Finance. He was somehow blamed for all this, but for whatever reason, that's why his nose has got this plaster on it, not because he's pretending to be a clown, because he was beaten up. So there you go. To sum up, I have no conclusions of my own. All I have is points for you to think about, what I call Shakespearean contradictions. The basic contradiction is this clash between feudalism and capitalism. As feudalism dies and capitalism is born, I think I've tried to illustrate this and its consequences. It's a very painful birth, and it's still with us in many ways. And I think I've tried to show that these plays and King John are still relevant, even though you may not have heard of Timon of Athens before this particular session. You'd heard of As You Like It, I'm sure, and The Merchant of Venice. And I think they relate to the ongoing liberal or neoliberal economic crisis in the world, let alone Europe, and the continued debt crisis. Every country is in debt. Great Britain is in debt. We hear about black holes every day. And Greece has one huge black hole. That's why we're at the bottom of the pile in terms of wealth. But these are the talking points I'd like to, or thinking points I'd like to leave you with. 6 of them, basically. Does Shakespeare agree or disagree with any of these, given what we've read of his work, what you know? Does he believe in any of this, shaking the superflux of excessive wealth to the poor? Your guess is as good as mine, where it's there in King Lear, as is the second one, the redistribution of wealth. That's one of his characters to say, distribution to undo excess. We've seen that he may not like the naked self-interest of unbridled capitalism. We've seen it in really all the cases I've looked at. He may be sympathetic to the good old world of paternalistic responsibility for the poor, the importance of pity and mercy. Like Dickens, I say, another one of my favorite writers, Shakespeare, I believe, brilliantly identifies the problem. Don't know if you agree, but in the end, they both identify the problem. Dickens did in Oliver Twist and so many other plays about debt as well, like, Little Dorrit and Bleak House. But he offers only charity, like Dickens does, and philanthropy as the solution. Do our two great writers agree on this? It's up to you to decide. And also to decide whether Shakespeare is still our contemporary. I think you can guess my point of view. I would take the question mark away, and I'll leave you with this pair of quotes. The great speech on mercy from the aristocratic princess from fairy tale Belmont, who pleaded for the quality of mercy, is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. And compare that to Blake, who said in his poem, The Human Abstract, from Songs of Innocence and Experience, pity would be no more if we did not make somebody poor. And mercy no more could be if all were as happy as we. Thank you very much.